The riverbank was alive with the usual sounds of nature: a steady ripple of water, the chirping of birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves as a soft breeze swept through. The fishermen had gathered early that morning, their tackle boxes and rods set up with the precision of men who had spent years perfecting their routine. Tom, the oldest of the group, was the first to notice something unusual. Across the bank, near the edge of the water, a dog stood completely still, its gaze fixed on the river. Its posture was tense, its tail motionless, as if every fiber of its being was focused on whatever lay beneath the surface. "Hey, look at that," Tom said, nodding toward the dog. The others glanced up, their conversations about bait and weather halting mid-sentence. The dog was scruffy, its fur a patchwork of brown and white, muddied and matted as though it had been roaming for days. Its ribs were faintly visible, suggesting it hadn't eaten well in some time. But what caught their attention wasn't the dog's ragged appearance. It was its unyielding focus. It stood rooted to the spot, ears twitching slightly, its eyes unblinking. "Probably spotted a fish," said Sam, the youngest of the group, shrugging it off. "Dogs do that, don't they?" Tom frowned. "Not like this. Look at it, it hasn't moved a muscle. That's not normal." The others watched in silence, each man growing uneasy without fully understanding why. It wasn't just the dog's stillness. It was the intensity in its gaze, the sense that it was guarding something. When Tom took a step toward the edge of the river to get a better look, the dog growled softly, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't a warning of aggression. It was something else entirely, a plea to stay back. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The dog didn't flinch, its eyes never leaving the water. "I don't like this," said Pete, a burly man with a deep voice that rarely carried doubt. "That dog's acting strange." "It's just a stray," Sam said again, though his tone was less certain now. "Maybe it's hungry or sick." Tom shook his head. "No, this is different. Look at its eyes. It's not just standing there for no reason." The group fell into a tense silence, their fishing rods forgotten. The river, which had always felt serene and familiar, now seemed to hold an air of mystery. The dog's behavior was unnerving, and the fishermen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as though the animal was guarding a secret, something hidden beneath the water that they weren't meant to see. "Maybe it's stuck on something," Pete suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Caught in a trap or tied to something. Doesn't look like it's struggling," Tom replied. "It's standing too still. Whatever it's doing, it's not normal." One of the men grabbed a piece of bread from their bait supplies and tossed it toward the dog, hoping to lure it away. The bread landed a few feet from the animal, but it didn't even glance at it. Its focus remained fixed, unbroken, as though nothing else in the world existed. "Now that's strange," Pete muttered. "What kind of stray ignores food?" Tom took a step closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. The dog growled again, louder this time, but still it didn't turn its head. It was a sound that carried urgency, not malice. Tom stopped in his tracks, feeling the weight of the animal's unspoken warning. "What do you think it's looking at?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No idea," Tom replied, his brow furrowed. "But I'm starting to think we should find out." He bent down and picked up a long stick, probing the shallow water near the dog. The water was clear but darkened by shadows from the overhanging trees. The stick hit something solid beneath the surface, a metallic clink that echoed faintly in the quiet. Tom froze, glancing back at the others. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yeah," Pete said, stepping closer. "What was it?" Tom poked the water again, the stick scraping against the object. It felt heavy, immovable, as though it were lodged in the riverbed. The dog let out a sharp bark, startling all of them. It was the first time the animal had made any sound other than its low growl, and the urgency in its bark was undeniable. "This dog's not leaving until we figure out what's down there," Tom said, determination hardening in his voice. He pulled off his boots, rolling up his pants, and waded into the river, the cold water biting against his skin. The dog barked again, pacing slightly but never leaving its spot. The others watched as Tom reached down, his hands searching the murky bottom. His fingers found the chain first, a rough, rusted length of metal buried in silt. His heart raced as he tugged at it, feeling the weight of something large and solid. Whatever it wasn't going to come free easily. "Help me out here," Tom called, glancing back at his friends. Pete and Sam hesitated for only a moment before joining him, rolling up their sleeves and stepping into the water. Together, they worked to loosen the object, the strain evident in their faces. As they pulled, the chain gave way slightly, revealing more of what lay beneath. It was a chest, waterlogged and covered in algae, its surface worn and battered by years submerged in the river. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their breath heavy from the effort. The dog barked again, its tail wagging slightly for the first time. It stepped closer to the water, as though encouraging them to continue. Whatever they had found, it was clear that this wasn't an ordinary discovery. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the chest was heavier than expected, its weight anchoring it stubbornly to the riverbed as the fishermen struggled to pull it free. The dog, still standing guard, had moved closer to the water's edge, its eyes never leaving their work. Tom, Pete, and Sam exchanged looks, part confusion, part anticipation. Whatever they had hooked, it wasn't just a random piece of river debris. "Almost there," Tom grunted, planting his feet firmly in the muddy riverbed as he gave one final tug. With a sucking sound, the chest broke free from the silt, sending a spray of water into the air. The three men stumbled back, catching their breath, their hands dripping with mud and grime. The chest sat between them, battered and worn, its surface marred by years beneath the river. Rust had eaten away at the hinges, and algae clung stubbornly to its sides, but it was intact and undeniably old. "What the hell is this?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with awe and unease. "No idea," Tom replied, running a hand over the corroded lid. "But it doesn't belong at the bottom of a river, that's for sure." Pete crouched beside the chest, tapping it lightly with his knuckle. "Feels solid. Whatever's in here didn't float away." The dog barked sharply, startling them. It circled the chest once, its tail wagging slightly, before sitting down again, its gaze fixed on the three men as if urging them to continue. "I think it wants us to open it," Sam said, half joking. Pete chuckled nervously. "Maybe it's got treasure maps in there. Or gold bars. Or a body," Tom muttered, his tone dark but not entirely serious. The others shot him a look. "What? We just dragged this thing out of a river. Could be anything." They stared at the chest for a moment, the weight of its mystery settling over them. Finally, Pete grabbed a crowbar from the truck parked nearby, muttering something about fishing gear and tools for every occasion. He returned quickly, wedging the crowbar under the edge of the lid. With a loud creak, the chest gave way, the hinges snapping as the lid was pried open. The smell hit them first, a musty, metallic odor mixed with the dampness of the river. Inside, the chest wasn't filled with gold or bones, but something equally intriguing. Stacks of water-damaged letters, age photographs, and a few tarnished pieces of jewelry. The letters, though warped and brittle, were still legible in parts. The photographs were black and white, their edges curled, showing glimpses of a time long past. A silver locket, its chain broken, glinted faintly in the sunlight. This isn't what I expected," Sam said, his voice quiet. He picked up one of the photographs, holding it delicately between his fingers. The image showed a young woman with a warm smile, her hair pinned back in soft curls. Beside her was a dog. Its resemblance to the one by the river was uncanny. "Look at this," Sam whispered, showing the photograph to the others. The dog barked softly, as if in recognition. "That can't be a coincidence," Tom said, shaking his head. "There's no way." Pete reached for one of the letters, carefully unfolding the damp paper. The ink had bled in places, but parts of it were still clear enough to read. "My dearest James," he read aloud, "I fear the time is drawing near when I'll have to make a choice. I know the risks, but I can't keep quiet any longer." He paused, scanning the rest of the letter, but much of it was illegible. "What do you think it means?" Sam asked, leaning closer. Tom frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like someone was in trouble. Maybe this James was supposed to help her." Pete flipped through the rest of the letters, finding similar phrases. "I'm afraid they'll never let me go. The truth must come out." His hands trembled slightly as he placed them back in the chest. This isn't just some old junk. This woman, whoever she was trying to say something. They fell silent, each man lost in thought. The weight of what they had found began to sink in. This wasn't a chest full of forgotten trinkets. It was a glimpse into someone's life, a life that had been interrupted, possibly ended, under circumstances they couldn't yet understand. The dog barked again, pulling them out of their thoughts. It wagged its tail briefly, then resumed its watchful stance, its eyes meeting Tom's with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "It's like it's waiting for us to figure this out," Sam murmured. Tom nodded, glancing back at the chest. "Whatever this is, it's been in that river for a long time. Someone put it there for a reason, and I think it's time we find out why." Pete hesitated. "Are we sure we want to get involved in this? This is starting to feel bigger than us." Tom sighed, his gaze drifting back to the photograph of the woman and her dog. "Maybe it is, but we can't just leave it. Whoever she was, she left these behind for a reason. We owe it to her to find out what happened." The three men stood in silent agreement. The chest wasn't just a curiosity, it was a responsibility. And the dog, still watching them with that strange, knowing gaze, seemed to be the one thing guiding them forward. The fishermen stood over the chest for a long time, unsure of their next move. The weight of what they had discovered hung heavy in the air, the river's gentle flow behind them, the only sound breaking the silence. Tom, ever the steady one in the group, finally spoke. "We need to take this to someone who knows what to do with it. We're fishermen, not detectives." Pete nodded slowly, wiping his muddy hands on his jeans. "Historical Society's got that old lady, Mrs. Elkins. She's always digging through town records and stories. If anyone can help, it's her." By late afternoon, they had loaded the chest in a Pete's truck and were driving to the small building that housed the town's Historical Society. Mrs. Elkins greeted them with a mix of curiosity and caution when they arrived, her sharp eyes narrowing at the chest. She was a petite woman with white hair pulled into a tight bun and a demeanor that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. "What's this about?" she asked, crossing her arms as the fishermen struggled to carry the heavy chest inside. "You drag in every piece of river junk you find?" Tom, used to Mrs. Elkins' bluntness, gave her a half smile. "Not quite. This one's different. We think it might mean something." They set the chest down with a thud, stepping back as Mrs. Elkins knelt beside it. Her sharp eyes scanned the contents, her fingers gently brushing over the letters and photographs. "Well, this isn't junk," she muttered, pulling out a water-damaged envelope. She unfolded a letter, squinting at the faded ink. "James," she read aloud, "I fear they know about what I've found. I don't know how much longer I can stay quiet." The room fell silent, the weight of the words sinking in. Mrs. Elkins' eyes flicked up to the fisherman. "Where exactly did you find this?" Tom gestured toward the river. "By the old willow, near the bend." The dog, it wouldn't leave the spot alone, almost like it wanted us to find it. Mrs. Elkins didn't seem surprised. "The willow. That's close to where Clara Morgan disappeared." "Clara Morgan?" Pete asked, leaning forward. "Who's that?" Mrs. Elkins sighed, her expression softening as she sat back on her heels. "She was a young woman who lived here about 50 years ago. She was bright, outspoken, and a bit too brave for her own good, some might say. She worked as a housekeeper for Mr. Hastings, the richest man in town back then." "Rich and shady," Tom muttered. Everyone in the room knew the Hastings family's reputation, even if it had faded over the decades. Mrs. Elkins nodded grimly. Clara was rumored to have uncovered something Hastings didn't want anyone to know. Corruption, embezzlement, mistreatment of his workers, you name it. She disappeared one summer, and people assumed she drowned. But there were whispers, people said Hastings had a hand in it, though nothing was ever proven. Pete's jaw tightened. "You think this chest is hers?" Mrs. Elkins held up a photograph of the young woman with the dog. "I bet my last dollar on it." "That's Clara." And that dog looks like the one that's been following you." The fishermen exchanged uneasy glances. The mystery was growing darker with every piece they uncovered. Tom ran a hand through his graying hair, his voice low. "So, what do we do now? Take it to the police?" Mrs. Elkins shook her head. "The police aren't going to investigate a 50-year-old case based on a few soggy letters and some old photographs. But if we can find more, something concrete, we might be able to prove what happened to Clara." "More?" Sam asked, his voice uncertain. "How do we even start looking for more?" Mrs. Elkins tapped the edge of the chest. "We start with the letters. If Clara wrote about what she found, there might be clues in here. And I'll dig through the archives. Hastings left a trail somewhere. People like him always do." Over the next few days, the fishermen found themselves swept up in the search for Clara's story. Mrs. Elkins worked tirelessly, combing through town records, old newspapers, and land deeds. She uncovered reports of disputes between Hastings and his workers, lawsuits that had mysteriously disappeared, and records of payments made to local officials around the time Clara vanished. Meanwhile, the fishermen studied the letters. Though much of the writing was faded or smudged, they pieced together fragments of Clara's life. Her love for James, her fear of Hastings, and her determination to expose the truth. The picture that emerged was one of a courageous woman caught in a dangerous game, silenced before she could finish what she started. One letter stood out among the rest. It was the last one Clara had written, dated only days before her disappearance. "James," Tom read aloud, "if anything happens to me, promise me you'll keep the chest safe. The truth is here, and someone has to find it." Pete leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. She knew something was coming. She knew Hastings wouldn't let her go. Tom glanced at the photograph of Clara and her dog. And that dog, it's like it's been waiting all these years to finish what she started. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was unsettling. Clara's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up, and now, after 50 years, the chest she had hidden was bringing her story to light. The fisherman couldn't stop thinking about the dog. It was always nearby, following at a distance or sitting quietly by the riverbank, as if watching over something only it understood. Even after they brought the chest to the Historical Society, the dog hadn't left the spot by the river for long, returning to sit in its usual place, as though tethered to it by an invisible thread. Tom was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "It's not just any stray. There's something about it, like it knows more than it should. Almost like it's waiting for something." Pete scoffed, but not with much conviction. "Come on, it's just a dog. Loyal, maybe, but it's not some supernatural guardian." Sam, always the quiet one, shook his head. "I don't think it's just about loyalty. Look at the photo. That dog, Clara's dog, it's practically a twin to this one. What if—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "What if this dog is tied to Clara somehow? Like family-wise, descendant, or whatever? Maybe it's been passed down, you know?" Tom stared at Sam, surprised by the idea, but unable to dismiss it outright. The resemblance between the dog in the photograph and the one by the river was uncanny. Its markings, the sharpness in its gaze, even its posture, everything about it seemed to echo the long-dead animal in the old black and white image. The possibility was strange, even unsettling, but it wasn't something they could brush off. "That dog's been here for a reason," Tom said finally. "I don't know what, but it's no coincidence." A few days after the chest had been handed over to Mrs. Elkins, the fishermen decided to visit the river again. The dog was still there, sitting at the water's edge, staring into the rippling surface. When it saw them approach, it stood, wagging its tail briefly before trotting toward them. Its manner wasn't aggressive but purposeful, as though it had been expecting them. "You're still here, huh?" Pete muttered, kneeling to get a better look at the dog. Its fur was slightly cleaner now, likely from wading into the river. Up close, its intelligent eyes were even more striking, a sharp amber that seemed almost human in their intensity. The dog barked softly, then turned and walked a few paces toward the water before stopping and looking back at them. It was an unmistakable gesture, as if it wanted them to follow. "Okay, now that's just weird," Sam said, his voice low. Without waiting for agreement, Tom followed the dog's lead, stepping closer to the riverbank. The others hesitated, but eventually trailed behind him. The dog led them to the exact spot where they had pulled up the chest days earlier, standing firmly in place and barking once. It scratched at the dirt near the water, its movements deliberate. "What is it trying to show us now?" Pete asked, his brows furrowed. "We already found the chest." Tom crouched, running his fingers through the soft earth where the dog had been digging. At first, there was nothing but dirt and pebbles, but then he hit something harder. Carefully, he dug deeper, his hands working quickly, until he unearthed a small, rusted object. It was an old key, its surface corroded from years of exposure to the elements. A key. Tom held it up, frowning. What would this be for? The dog barked again, its tail wagging slightly, as though satisfied with their discovery. It backed away, sitting down and watching them with an expectant gaze. "Do you think it's for something in the chest?" Sam asked, leaning in to inspect the key. "Could be," Pete said, scratching his chin. Or maybe it's for something else entirely. Something Clara wanted us to find." Tom pocketed the key, a growing sense of purpose settling over him. This wasn't just about solving a mystery anymore. The dog's unwavering behavior, the chest, the letters, it all felt like a puzzle Clara had left behind, one they were meant to piece together. As they returned to town, the dog followed them closely but stopped just outside the Historical Society, sitting down as if to mark its boundary. Mrs. Elkins greeted them with her usual sharp tone, but her expression softened when they showed her the key. "Interesting," she said, turning it over in her hand. "This looks old, very old. If it's connected to Clara, it might unlock something else she left behind. But where do we even start looking?" Pete asked. Mrs. Elkins tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Clara lived in one of Hastings' properties before she disappeared. The house has been abandoned for years, but it's still standing. If there's anything else she hid, it would be there." Tom felt a jolt of excitement. The idea of returning to Clara's old home was daunting but exhilarating. They were no longer just stumbling on pieces of a mystery. They were actively chasing it now, driven by the feeling that Clara's story needed to be told. As they left the Historical Society, the dog watched them from its spot by the door. Tom knelt beside it, scratching behind its ears. "You're not just any dog, are you?" he murmured. The animal leaned into his touch briefly before trotting back toward the river, its job seemingly not yet finished. They watched it go, a quiet resolve settling among them. The pieces were coming together, but there was still more to uncover. And somehow, they knew the dog wouldn't stop until they found it all. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the fishermen stood outside Arthur's small, weathered house, hesitating. They'd been told by Mrs. Elkins that Arthur might have answers about Clara Morgan, but none of them were sure how he would react to their uninvited visit. Arthur was known for being a recluse, a man who preferred his solitude and rarely entertained visitors. Tom, as the most diplomatic of the group, took the lead and knocked on the door. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Arthur. He was a tall man, though age had bent his back slightly. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his skin weathered like leather from decades of outdoor work. His gray eyes studied the group with suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. Tom cleared his throat, holding out the photograph of Clara and her dog. "We're sorry to bother you, sir, but we were told you might know something about this woman." "Clara Morgan?" Arthur's gaze flickered to the photograph, and his expression tightened. For a moment, he didn't respond, and Tom worried they'd overstepped. Finally, Arthur sighed and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice low. "But don't touch anything." The house was cluttered but clean, a mix of old furniture and stacks of books and newspapers. Arthur motioned for them to sit at the worn dining table, and he eased himself into a chair across from them. His hands, knotted with age, rested on the table as he studied the photograph again. "I knew Clara," he said finally, his voice tinged with sadness. "Not well, but enough to know she didn't deserve what happened to her." "What had happened to her?" Tom asked gently. Arthur hesitated, his gaze distant. "She disappeared. Everyone in town said she drowned, but anyone with sense knew that wasn't the truth. She was too strong, too careful. Clara didn't just vanish on her own. Pete leaned forward, his voice low. We found this chest near the river. It had her letters, photographs, even a key. She mentioned Hastings in the letters. Was he involved? Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line, and he let out a heavy sigh. Hastings, he muttered, the name dripping with disdain. That man had half the town under his thumb back then. Money, power. He had it all. Clara worked for him, cleaning his house and running errands. But she was no fool. She saw things, heard things, and she wasn't afraid to speak up. Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water. After taking a sip, he continued, I was working for Hastings at the time, too. Not by choice. I didn't have much of one. Clara and I didn't talk much, but I knew she was digging into things she shouldn't have. Hastings was laundering money, cheating people out of their land, and bribing officials. Clara found proof of it. She tried to confront him. Tom's stomach sank. What happened when she did? Arthur looked away, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I overheard them arguing one night. She told him she was going to the authorities, that she had enough evidence to ruin him. He laughed in her face, called her naive, but then he got quiet. Too quiet. I knew that look he gave her. It was the kind of look that meant trouble. Pete clenched his fists. You think he killed her? Arthur met his gaze, unflinching. I know he did. I didn't see it happen, but I heard enough. That same night, Clara's dog was barking like mad, louder than I'd ever heard. Then it went silent. By morning, Clara was gone. Hastings told everyone she'd run off, but I knew better. The room was silent, the weight of Arthur's words pressing down on them. Sam, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Why didn't you say anything back then? Arthur's face hardened, a flicker of shame crossing his features. Because I was scared. Hastings had the sheriff in his pocket, half the town too. If I'd said anything, I would have been next. Maybe I was a coward, but I've lived with that guilt every day since. Tom leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Do you know what she might have done with the evidence? Did she hide it somewhere? Arthur nodded slowly. She told me once that if anything happened to her, the truth would find its way out eventually. I think that's what the chest was, her way of keeping it safe. But if there's more evidence, it would have been at Hastings' estate. She spent so much time there. Sam glanced at Tom. The key. It could open something there. Arthur frowned. Key. Tom pulled the rusted key from his pocket, holding it out for Arthur to see. The older man's eyes widened slightly. That looks like it could be from the estate. Hastings had all kinds of locked drawers and cabinets. Arthur's voice softened as he stared at the key. If you're really doing this, be careful. That man's legacy still has roots in this town, even if he's long gone. There are people who won't want this stirred up. Tom nodded. We'll be careful. But Clara deserves justice, even if it's 50 years late. As they stood to leave, Arthur's voice stopped them at the door. Thank you, he said quietly, for doing what I couldn't. Tom turned back, meeting the old man's gaze. It's not too late to set things right. Arthur's eyes shone with unshed tears as he nodded. I hope you're right. The fisherman left the house, the rusted key heavy in Tom's pocket and the weight of the truth even heavier on their shoulders. The dog was waiting for them outside, its tail wagging faintly as if to say, there's still more to do. The fisherman stood outside the community hall, clutching the chest and its mysterious contents as they prepared to face the gathered townsfolk. Word of their discovery had spread quickly, thanks to Mrs. Elkins and her connections in the historical society. People were curious, skeptical, and, in some cases, downright dismissive. Yet here they were, filing into the hall on a crisp evening, drawn by a mix of intrigue and a thirst for answers. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The room was packed with faces both familiar and distant. Older residents who had lived through the days of Hastings' dominance, younger generations who only knew his name from half-forgotten tales, and a handful of skeptical descendants of the once powerful Hastings family. Tom set the chest down on a table at the front of the room, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to steady them. Pete and Sam flanked him, their usually light-hearted expressions replaced with somber resolve. Mrs. Elkins, standing nearby, offered a firm nod of encouragement. All right, let's get this started. Tom said, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the crowd. "We've got something to show you all, something that might change the way we remember this town." That got their attention. The murmuring stopped, and all eyes turned to the chest. Tom opened it, carefully lifting out the letters and photographs. The room collectively leaned forward, curiosity etched on their faces. "This chest belonged to a woman named Clara Morgan," Tom began. "Some of you might remember her name. Others might have heard it mentioned in passing. She worked for Mr. Hastings back in the day, the same Hastings who had this town in his grip for decades." A few heads nodded, though others remained still, their expressions unreadable. "Clara disappeared 50 years ago," Tom continued. "Official story was that she drowned. But we've uncovered letters that suggest something else, something much darker." Mrs. Elkins stepped forward, holding up one of Clara's letters. "This is a letter Clara wrote to a man named James, her lover at the time. In it, she talks about uncovering evidence of Hastings' corruption, money laundering, land theft, and bribery. She was brave, but she was also scared. She knew Hastings was dangerous, and she wrote these letters because she feared for her life." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Letters don't prove anything," a man called out from the back. His sharp features and haughty demeanor marked him as a Hastings descendant. "This is ancient history. You're dredging up rumors with no solid evidence." Tom's jaw tightened, but Mrs. Elkins responded with calm authority. "These letters are a part of Clara's truth. And Arthur, who worked for Hastings, has corroborated what Clara wrote. He heard their confrontation the night she disappeared." The room fell silent again. Arthur, seated in the corner, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. He had reluctantly agreed to attend, though it was clear he preferred to avoid the spotlight. Still, when the moment came, he stood. "I worked for Hastings," Arthur said, his voice gravelly but firm. "I heard him threaten Clara. I saw the fear in her eyes. And I heard her dog barking that night, barking like it was trying to protect her. Then nothing. Next morning, Clara was gone." The crowd reacted in waves. Some gasped, while others crossed their arms, their skepticism hardening. "That's still not proof," the Hastings descendant pressed, his tone cold. "You're smearing my family's name based on hearsay." Pete, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Your family's name doesn't need smearing. It did that all on its own. We're not here to attack anyone. We're here because Clara deserves to be heard. She tried to expose the truth, and she paid for it." Sam held up the rusted key they'd found. "This might be the proof we need. Clara hid this chest, and she left this key. It could lead us to more of the evidence she was trying to protect." The room buzzed again, the tension palpable. Some faces showed guilt, others defiance. A few elderly attendees, who had lived under Hastings' shadow, nodded slowly, as if the pieces were finally clicking into place. One woman, her gray hair tied neatly in a bun, raised her hand. "I remember Clara," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She was kind. She didn't deserve what happened to her. If there's a way to clear her name, we should do it." Her words seemed to shift the mood in the room. Others began to speak up, sharing fragmented memories of Clara or voicing their support for uncovering the truth. Still, the Hastings descendant wasn't finished. "You're digging up a past that should stay buried," he said bitterly. "What good will it do?" Tom met his glare with steady resolve. "It'll do a lot of good. It'll give Clara the justice she never got. And it'll remind this town that we don't get to bury the truth just because it's inconvenient." The dog, which had been lying quietly by the door, stood and barked, the sound echoing through the hall. All eyes turned to it, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The dog's presence, so unwavering and deliberate, felt like a silent witness to everything they had uncovered. As the meeting ended, the crowd began to disperse, the weight of what they had learned lingering in the air. Some walked away with newfound purpose, while others left in quiet denial. The fishermen stood together, watching the dog return to the riverbank. Its job wasn't done yet, and neither was theirs. The key in Sam's hand felt heavier now, a reminder that there was still more to uncover, and more truth waiting to be revealed. In the days following the meeting, the town buzzed with conflicting emotions. Some residents couldn't stop talking about the revelation surrounding Clara Morgan's disappearance, while others clung stubbornly to the belief that the past should stay buried. But for Tom, Pete, Sam, and Mrs. Elkins, there was no turning back. The rusted key they'd found by the river had become their guiding beacon, a final clue they hoped would unlock the full truth. With Mrs. Elkins' help, the fishermen arranged to visit the old Hastings estate. The sprawling mansion, now abandoned and overgrown with ivy, sat on the outskirts of town, a decaying reminder of the wealth and power the Hastings family once wielded. Stepping onto the property felt like walking into another era, one shrouded in shadows and secrets. "This place gives me the creeps," Sam muttered as they approached the front door, its paint chipped and peeling. "Good," Pete replied, gripping the key in his hand. "Maybe that means we're on the right track." Mrs. Elkins had brought the blueprints of the house, which she'd unearthed from the town archives. She directed them to a study on the first floor, a room where Hastings had conducted much of his business. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew. Bookshelves lined the walls, and an ornate desk stood in the center, its surface covered in a layer of grime. "This is where he spent most of his time," Mrs. Elkins said, her voice low. "If Clara hid something, it might be here." They searched the room methodically, checking drawers, cabinets, and the floorboards beneath the heavy desk. Hours passed with no success, frustration mounting as they uncovered nothing more than rotting papers and broken furniture. But just as the light outside began to fade, Sam's voice broke the silence. "Over here," he called, crouching near a small, ornate cabinet in the corner. He had noticed a faint outline of a lock on its side, hidden by years of grime and neglect. Pete rushed over, the key trembling slightly in his hand. With a deep breath, he inserted it into the lock. It fit perfectly. Turning it with a loud click, they opened the cabinet to reveal a hidden compartment inside. Within it was a stack of papers, sealed envelopes, and a leather-bound journal. Tom carefully retrieved the items, his hand steady despite the gravity of the moment. Flipping through the journal, he recognized Clara's handwriting immediately. The entries were detailed, documenting everything she had discovered about Hastings' illegal activities: names, dates, amounts, even copies of falsified documents she had found in his possession. It was the kind of evidence that could have destroyed him. "She risked everything for this," Tom said quietly, his voice heavy with admiration and sorrow. Mrs. Elkins examined the papers, her expression somber. "This is enough to clear her name, and to expose what Hastings did to this town." The group left the estate in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The dog was waiting for them at the edge of the property, its amber eyes watching intently as they emerged. It barked once, a short, sharp sound that felt almost like approval, before trotting ahead of them as they made their way back to town. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Mrs. Elkins worked tirelessly to organize the evidence, presenting it to the local authorities and the media. The story quickly gained traction, with reporters descending on the small town to uncover the long-buried scandal. Hastings' descendants, once untouchable, found themselves under scrutiny as questions about their family's legacy mounted. For the fishermen, the journey felt bittersweet. They had started with a simple day of fishing and stumbled into a mystery that had changed their lives. Seeing Clara's name cleared brought them a sense of pride, but it also underscored the cost of silence and injustice. The town held a memorial for Clara by the river where the chest had been found. Dozens of residents gathered, including people who had never known her but felt compelled to honor her bravery. The dog stood at the front of the crowd, its presence as steady and commanding as ever. When the mayor unveiled a small plaque commemorating Clara's courage and sacrifice, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. Arthur, who had remained reclusive even as the story unfolded, surprised everyone by attending the memorial. He stood at the back of the crowd, his hat in hand, his eyes misty with emotion. When it was over, he approached the fisherman and Mrs. Elkins. "You did right by her," he said quietly. "Thank you." Tom shook his hand firmly. "We couldn't have done it without you. You gave her a voice when no one else would." Arthur nodded, his lips trembling as he fought back tears. I just wish I'd been braver back then." The dog barked again, breaking the heavy silence. It walked to Arthur, nuzzling his hand as if to comfort him. Arthur knelt, stroking its fur with a small, grateful smile. "Good dog," he murmured. "You've done her proud." As the crowd began to disperse, the fishermen lingered by the river, watching the water flow gently in the fading light. The dog stood with them for a moment, its gaze fixed on the horizon. Then, without a sound, it turned and trotted away, disappearing into the woods as mysteriously as it had come. Tom watched it go, a strange mix of sadness and peace settling over him. "Think we'll ever see it again?" Pete shrugged. "I don't know, but I think it's done what it came here to do." They stood in silence, the river's soft murmur filling the space between them. Clara's story had finally been told, her courage remembered, and her name cleared. The past, once buried in darkness, had been brought into the light. For the fishermen, it was enough. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the fishermen stayed by the river long after the memorial had ended, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the rippling water. The crowd had dispersed, the murmurs of conversation fading into the quiet rustle of trees and the gentle hum of crickets. It felt fitting, this moment of silence. The river had carried Clara's secrets for so long, and now, with her story finally told, it seemed to flow with a renewed sense of peace. Tom glanced at the others. Pete stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the spot where they had first seen the dog. Sam sat on a large rock, his head bowed as if lost in thought. None of them spoke. There wasn't much left to say. Their journey had been unexpected, but it had brought them a purpose they hadn't known they needed. The dog stood a short distance away, its posture as still and steady as ever. Its amber eyes seemed to take in the river, the trees, and the fishermen all at once, as if committing the scene to memory. Then, without warning, it barked, a sharp, clear sound that echoed through the quiet evening. The men turned to watch as the dog began to walk away, its steps unhurried but deliberate. "Wait," Sam called, rising to his feet. He took a few steps forward, but Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let it go," Tom said softly. "It's done what it needed to do." Pete nodded, his voice low. "That dog, it's not just any dog. I don't know how or why, but it was here for her. For Clara. And now that she's at peace, maybe it can be too." Sam hesitated, his eyes following the dog as it disappeared into the woods. He let out a long sigh and stepped back, his shoulders slumping. "I just thought, I don't know, maybe it'd stick around. Maybe it was never meant to," Tom replied, his tone thoughtful. "Some things come into our lives to guide us, then move on. Doesn't mean they weren't important." The three men stood in silence again, their gazes lingering on the path the dog had taken. It was strange, the way the animal had seemed to carry Clara's presence with it, as if it had been her guardian all these years. They couldn't explain it, but they didn't need to. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. As the night deepened, the fishermen finally made their way back to Pete's truck. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. They had started with a simple day of fishing and ended up unearthing a story that had altered their lives and their town forever. In the days that followed, life began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The fishermen returned to the river, though their outings felt different now. The spot where they had found the chest seemed sacred in a way, a place forever tied to Clara's memory. They fished quietly, their conversations softer, more reflective. The town, too, began to heal. The story of Clara Morgan spread far beyond their small community, drawing attention from journalists, historians, and even filmmakers. For the first time in decades, her name was spoken with admiration and respect, her courage celebrated rather than forgotten. The Hastings family's legacy, once a symbol of power, was now a cautionary tale about greed and corruption. One morning, as Tom sat by the river alone, he felt a strange sense of calm. The water flowed steadily, the sun casting golden ripples across its surface. He thought about Clara, about her bravery, her determination, and the quiet strength she must have possessed to stand up to someone as powerful as Hastings. He thought about the dog, its unwavering loyalty, and the way it had seemed to bridge the gap between the past and the present. As he cast his line into the water, a movement in the distance caught his eye. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the dog standing on the opposite bank, its silhouette framed by the morning light. It stood there, watching him, its amber eyes gleaming with an almost otherworldly intensity. Tom blinked, and just like that, the dog was gone. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Whether it had been real or just his imagination, he didn't care. He felt its presence all the same, a quiet reminder of everything they had accomplished. The river, the dog, and Clara's story were all connected, threads woven into a tapestry that would never unravel. Tom packed up his gear as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He glanced at the river one last time before heading back to his truck, his steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Clara had found her justice. The town had found its truth. And somehow, he felt they had all been made better for it. As he drove away, the river flowed on, carrying with it the echoes of a story that had finally been told. The dog, wherever it had gone, was no longer needed by the river's edge. Its job was done, its purpose fulfilled. And though its absence left a quiet ache, it also left behind something greater, a sense of peace, of closure, and the enduring power of loyalty and truth. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.